This is Mark Lieberman, host of the podcast and radio show, The World According to Mark. And I'm happy to introduce my guest for today's podcast, marthaannetoll, who's speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Martha, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview.
Thanks, Mark. I'm so happy to be here. Really appreciate it.
Well, you found me, and I'm glad that we got together. I think I don't exaggerate by saying you're an extraordinary figure, person, accomplished, but the impetus for this interview is that you have recently debuted a novel called Three Muses, which is published by the Regal House Publishing Company. And they, in turn, awarded you the, I'm going to try this, Petrichor Prize for Finely Crafted Fiction, which, wow, they couldn't just say, yeah, good job or thumbs up. Yeah, that's a mouthful. And so we're going to talk about that novel, your inspiration. We're not going to give away the ending. We're going to talk about sort of the general plot, what your motivation was, but we're also going to talk about you and your interests, because you're a multi-talented, multifaceted person, including you are don't practice law, but you got your law degree and you practiced for a while, and then you devoted your attention besides writing and editing and a lot of other stuff that you do to social justice issues. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
And so I said it was a debut novel. That really doesn't give credit to the fact that you've been writing for years and years, and that you have other novels, including a couple that are one that's on the verge of being published soon, another one which is in process, could be published later, and other novels which you sought to get published, which weren't published, and phooey on those people who didn't do it.
I want to correct the record. I have
Please.
a novel that is on submission, which means I am trying to get it published. I don't have a contract. So
Okay.
I'm really careful to say that, because anybody who writes novels knows that this is a long journey.
Spoken like a true lawyer as well.
Well, I don't want to be misinformed.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you for correcting me. So let's, why don't we start, just give us a sort of a short version of what this novel is about and the process for you writing it, which I think took 12 years, if I'm not mistaken, which is 12 years is a long time to do anything. But in any event, what is this book about? Who are the three muses? How did you come to write this? And now I'm going to be quiet.
Well, first I'm going to do some show and tell. This is my copy of Three Muses with a lot of stickies, because I've been doing some readings. I had nothing to do with this beautiful cover, but I love it. The publisher has a resident artist that made the cover. And if you could see it up close, you would see that it is a ballerina sitting behind barbed wire. And that's one reason I love the cover, because it suggests almost the whole story. So, as Mark said, I started writing in earnest around the time my mom died, which was 1999. So it took me 22 years to get a novel published, 20 years, whatever. And so, like many other writers, there's a lot of novels that didn't get published. So this is my debut novel, in the sense that it's the one that's out in the world, and I'm incredibly grateful. I was looking for a way to frame a story. I had the concept of a ballerina, and I had the concept of a Holocaust survivor who survived by his mother as a child. His mother and he and his little brother are in line for the gas chamber, and his mother says to the SS guard, Yanko can sing. Yanko was 11 at that time, and he became John Curtin when he came to this country. So Yanko survives as a little boy, singing for the commandant of the camp that killed his family. And I also had a concept of a ballerina. She, as a child, was named Catherine. Her grown-up name, which her choreographer, lover, abuser, me tooer, all those things, gives her. Her choreographer renames her Katya Simonova, even though she's a girl from Queens, in order to give her a fancy Russian name. She lost her mother in a car accident when she was 7. So there are these two characters who've had some significant childhood trauma. And John eventually makes his way to the United States, and he becomes a psychiatrist. He is invited into the home and adopted by a lovely couple named Barney and Selma, who lost their only son in the battle for Sicily in World War II. And they adopt John and they want to give him what they would have given their son, which is medical school. And by a random chance, a neighbor says, well, you should become a brain doctor because you've had so much trauma, basically. So he does. John becomes a psychiatrist and he goes. So now I'm going to stop for a minute. I'm going to say what the three muses are because that's a little bit of the plot. The three muses that frame this story are song, discipline, and memory. And this tradition of Greek mythology came from the region of Boeotia, which is part of Greece. And I think what happens with any mythologies is they evolve differently in different parts of even one society or a varied society. So when I heard about these three muses, I felt like lightning had struck. I was thought, well, these are the muses that frame my book. So John is loosely associated with song, and song slash music are a very mixed bag for him. It is what saved his life, but it is also a lifelong trauma because he had to sing for his family's killer. So he's on a medical conference as an adult in Paris. He's given a ticket to the ballet and he falls in love with a ballerina, which is pretty much the worst thing he could do because a ballerina cannot make a living. She cannot work without music. So he's in conflict in the most profound way. The ballerina, Katya Simonova, is loosely associated with discipline. And I don't speak ancient Greek, but I was really excited to learn that this word for discipline also brings into its meaning a priest preparing for prayer. And I sort of like that spiritual side of it. I like the work side and the spiritual side. The third muse is memory, and memory is something that I think is terribly important for all of us, particularly for these characters who have such damaged memories. And also on the sort of meta level, Jewish character who thinks about this and is told this as a child that we Jewish people have a large collective memory, and it's sort of how we've survived. We don't build cathedrals and big monuments and stuff like that. The collective memory is really what's held Jewish people together. So they're different meanings. When John falls in love with Katya, he has no idea that she's enmeshed with this choreographer named Boris. So that is a not short summary of the plot.
Well, I'm going to take a bit of a risk here of showing some ignorance on my part, but I think it might be useful if we just mention, or if you explain this concept of muses. You've told us the origin of it as being Greek mythology, and that there were multiple muses, more than 3. But as I recall, the concept of muse, and we talked about this offline at preparing for this interview, is a muse in my head, what it is or was an inspiration, an inspirational figure or an inspirational idea that helps to motivate and perhaps facilitate a person in a creative endeavor. So
that's absolutely true. And that is absolutely the way that word is used as we use it now. And in my book, Katya is Boris Yannikov, her choreographer's muse. Absolutely. She is the person that inspires him to make ballets. And one of the conflicts in the book is that she actually co-creates those ballets with him, and she never gets any credit. Now, I want to emphasize that a lot of the action in the book happens in the 1950s, and much of the action is in 1963, just before John F. Kennedy was murdered. And so there's a lot of Me Too stuff in terms of Katya's relationship with her choreographer. And one of it is that she doesn't get credit for anything she's doing, and that is a great frustration to her. But for sure, Katya is Boris Yanikov's muse. I was a kid who thought the Greek muses were really fun. There's a classic children's book by Daulaire called about the Greek mythology. It's beautifully illustrated, and we had that in my house growing up. And in the more well-known strand of Greek mythology, there were nine muses, and I think the concept they were like demigods. They weren't really big gods like Zeus or Mars or whatever. That's Roman, but um, they were demigods who did inspire various creative pursuits. And so, in the tradition that we are more familiar with today in the 21st century, there were nine muses. There was a muse of poetry and a muse of dance and a muse of music and history. And so there were all kinds of. It was a wider group. A discipline was not a muse in that tradition. So I am by no means an expert in this, but I think people who will have heard of the Greek muses will have heard of nine.
Okay, so let me just catch up a little bit with what you said. You mentioned now that discipline, which is one of the three of the muses that are according to your novel, is not historical in the sense of the Greeks, but you gave it that characterization of a
Well,
muse.
no, I think it is historical in the sense that there was a different strand of Greek mythology from Boeotia, and they only thought there were three muses. And this is all magical.
Okay.
So however you think about it. So I didn't make that up, but I found it by accident, and then I really couldn't get any more information about it. It's just um, mentioned, and now I can't even remember by who, but it's mentioned by a Greek chronicler, and not much else is known about it.
Okay. So I'm choosing my words carefully. It was, in some ways, it was a jumping off point for this novel, but it also sounded like, from what you said a moment ago, 2 moments ago, is that the idea for this novel was sort of percolating before you necessarily connected up with the muses. So let me ask you this question. Hopefully this is not an unfair question. Do you, Martha Toll, have muses that help inspire you to do what you do?
That is such a good question. Um, I don't even know how to answer that. I would probably say, in some ways, memory is my muse. And I don't write autobiographical work, but I'm very inspired by emotional memory, and that is a complex thing for me. I mean, like all humans, it includes grief and sadness, but it also includes great joy and um, even euphoria. So I wouldn't say that I have a specific muse, although many people do. And many people are very open about it.
Okay. So you've talked about, one of the characters is a professional ballerina. And so you didn't just come up with the idea of, why don't I talk about ballet or ballerina? You yourself have experience in that mode. So can you talk about that?
Sure. So my mother, I'm one of four girls. I'm sure she gave us all the option of taking ballet. She was very interested and very committed to our cultural education. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, and I'm pretty sure I went to my first ballet class at age 4, and I was just completely smitten. And over time, my mother put me into the school of the Pennsylvania Ballet, which is now called the Philadelphia Ballet. And I just loved it. I couldn't spend enough time there. I was there as much as I could. I was overjoyed, even as a very young child, to watch the professional company rehearse. That, I don't know, that just still made such a deep impression. Unfortunately, I had no talent, and I guess the clearer way to say this, I absolutely don't have the right body for it. I have poor flexibility, not good feet, all kinds of things that are not good for a ballerina. And because this was a professional school, they were very open about that. and it was quite difficult. They essentially made it really clear they wouldn't advance me past the age of 12-ish, 13-ish, 12, I think. And I viewed it at the time as an epic failure. I was young. I mean, I look back on it now, I think in some ways it was a great gift. I really, really believe in failure. I don't think, and it's certainly in the generation of my kids, who are adults, there's in some ways we don't allow our kids to fail enough. I think failure is really valuable because if you can pick yourself up from it, you are emboldened and strengthened by it. But I mean, it wasn't fun at the time. It was very disappointing. And then I basically kept up. I read ballet reviews and I go to a lot of ballet performances. So in some ways, it was just imprinted on my body. And even though without the talent, which is interesting.
Let me reintroduce my guest. That is, or this is Martha Ann Toll, who just came out with her debut novel, The Three Muses, which we will be discussing in a little more detail and also a little more of her life. And she just told us her history in terms of actually participating and learning about ballet, and deciding to choose another path. This is hardly consistent with what you just talked about, but my parents decided that I needed to take tap dancing, not sensing that I had a talent, but quite the opposite. Some folks had said, he's a little awkward. I think he might benefit from tap dancing. Now, I was never asked about what particular artistic achievement I wanted to pursue. I would have said piano or guitar or like comedy or improv, but I went ahead with their wishes. And I won't say it was traumatic, but everything that I thought could go wrong with me and tap dancing went wrong. And so it's now comedy, because I remember that we did a number with a hotel type office bell, and we were supposed to do our shuffle, tap, tap, and all that. And I remember accidentally kicking the bell across the room during the recital, and that was pretty much the end. I didn't need to get didn't need to get the message. But in any event,
So sorry. I mean, I think that's true for many, many students of ballet. I mean, there are dancers who became worldwide famous names who started that way. I mean, I recently learned that George Balanchine, who's the sort of preeminent choreographer of the 20th century, he grew up in Imperial Russia. This is before the Russian Revolution, and his family had fallen on hard times. And if you got your kid into the ballet school, they got a free ride and they boarded, so they got food. And his sister tried out, she didn't get in. And little Georgie was standing there at age 9, and they saw him. We're like, we need a boy. So his mother just stuck him in the school. So she literally left him. He had to board there. That's how he got started, totally against his will, totally abandoned by his mother. And there are many stories like that. I was a childhood asthmatic, and you're the first person who's made me realize this. I think the reason my mother supported this was because she thought it would be good for my breathing, which is interesting.
okay. Well, let's talk about the inspiration a little bit more for the other prime character, John, who was called Yanka in the concentration camp. What was your thinking about blending, or not blending, but moving him into a core role in this novel?
Well, I still don't quite know how he came to me, but he came to me as a fully formed character. And I definitely am a person who has great interest in the Holocaust. I grew up in a very, very, very secular Jewish family. And in some ways, the Holocaust was my first introduction to Judaism. And I'm related to Holocaust survivors, and I knew Holocaust survivors who were my friends' parents. And it really, really meant something to me. I mean, especially as I got older and I began to think about it, I had two thoughts. One is the Holocaust is so close in time to my own birth. It's not some ancient thing that we can say, oh, they were barbarians then. Second of all, in my family, my father's side is Ukrainian and my mother's side is German. On the German side, and in Germany in general, the situation of German Jews, they were also extremely secular. Reform Judaism has its roots in Germany. And there's a famous historian, Holocaust refugee named Peter Gay, who said, I didn't know I was Jewish until Hitler was elected. And I think that's true for so many German Jews. They were as assimilated as American Jews are. And that is really sobering when you come to think of it. So it haunted me, and I've read about it all my life. And as I've gotten older, I've asked people to tell me their stories, children of Holocaust survivors to tell me their stories. And these survivor stories are just unbelievable. And I always want to remind readers and listeners that only a tiny, tiny fraction of people survived.
So I want to touch a little bit on the Holocaust, and again, because it is a significant part of the book, and you've just explained how it was also an integral part of your understanding of who you are, your ancestrage, and so on. You mentioned just a moment ago, that many Jews living in Germany did not, because they were, quote, secular. But beyond that, they didn't think of themselves as Jews in a religious orientation or much at all. That is presumably a reflection not only of those people, but also a complacency which developed because of how they understood Germany and its acceptance of Jews, or the seeming acceptance of Jews, which of course turned out to be very superficial, and it didn't take long for the majority, presumably, of the population in Germany to turn on Jews, to identify Jews, to call out Jews, to label Jews, to make them wear the Star of David, and ultimately to send them to concentration camps and to their death. It seems to me, but again, I don't want to get too much in terms of present tense, but everything has a past and a future and a present. We're experiencing some of that right now, not just in the United States, across the world, but principally, I'm talking about the United States, where things about the Holocaust, about Holocaust deniers, things about who Jews are and the extent to which people still continue to believe that somehow they're responsible for everything from wildfires in California to inflation to, a bunch of other stuff. How do you resonate with that?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm by no means an expert, but I'll take a stab at it. I do want to say you use the word complacency in Germany. I mean, I think they, like, if somebody asks me who I am, I'll say I'm an American. I won't say I'm Jewish first. So German Jews they were German first, and many people. So Jews served in the German army alongside everybody else. I mean, they were Germans in World War One. And that was something that really slowed down people's ability to take in what was happening. They're like, okay, I'm a German soldier. They're never going to do anything to me. I served in the army. And so I agree with you. I think there are tremendous, really painful, scary resonances today. So first of all, um, there are two sides of this coin. There was very difficult for Jews to emigrate here, and there were many varieties of Jewish people in Europe. German Jews were, quote, more European Jews beyond the pale in Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, um, the whole eastern part of Russia, Ukraine. Those Jews, Romania, all of Eastern Europe, were considered to be they were lower class, they were less cultured, they were more insulated. And there's a lot of prejudice within the Jewish community about that. But anyway, I just want to make that clear. There's an enormous variety of Jewish people in Europe, all of whom were slaughtered. But In this country, Roosevelt did not really allow a lot of immigration, despite the fact that there were Jewish leaders begging him and who understood what was going on. So we can come back to that, but today, what I want to say is over time, Jews in the United States became classified as white people, and we have benefited from whiteness. So the same thing happened with Italians, Irish, and Jews who came over as were not allowed. Don't eat here if you're Irish. Don't eat here if you're Italian. You can't be a cop if you're Irish. So we have a long history in America of tremendous bigotry. But Jews were ultimately given the privilege of whiteness. And I want to say that because it is not something that Black people and brown people in this country have been able to get. And that's a complicated story. And we, white people, need to understand it really deeply. We ignore it at our peril. However, that said, when push comes to shove, the extreme right does not see Jewish people as white people. We are still the devil. Charlottesville is a very recent example of that, and January 6th is more recent. There were, I don't even know what they were. I wouldn't repeat them if I did, but there were horrifying anti-Semitic chants in Charlottesville. We've seen the murders in Pittsburgh. There were people wearing just horrifying T-shirts at January 6th. So in this country, Jews are still, by the extreme right, they're still vilified. There's still terrible myths about the Margaret, whatever her name is, Marjorie Taylor Greene, as talking about Jews with lasers. I don't want to go into it. So, but I don't want to just talk about anti-Semitism. That's a problem here. But whatever the bigotry is, and we are, I hope, in a time of racial reckoning here, where we Americans, particularly we white Americans, need to deeply understand our history of racism and bigotry, because you said this, Mark, it doesn't go away and it comes back. And we're seeing this in this virulent anti-immigrant, anti-refugee backlash right now, the othering, you can just go kill Muslim people with no repercussions or very little repercussions. You don't even make the front page. I want to say that we ignore this at our peril. And I also want to say that unless you are Native American or you came in chains, you are an immigrant to this country. So the idea that we're vilifying our own past makes no sense to me. So that's just the tip of the iceberg for me.
So a number of really important points that you made, and I'm not going to go back and repeat them. I think you've sort of stated some really resonant views about things. One thing that did strike me in what you said is Jews were either white or they weren't white. Being able to be white gave those folks who, accepted them in some fashion a justification, because they're white people. But as soon as the tide turns, you have a difficult economy or difficult political issues, those same people can slide Jews back into a finite category. It's unfortunate, but it seems like it makes sense. Well, you're really just another person of color, and then for those purposes, you're indistinguishable from indigenous people or people that came to this country as slaves. So it's a sobering topic, and I want to get back into the story, but I do want to just mention, and we talked about this before we went online, Ken Burns, a very skilled documentarian, recently had a 3-part series on the Holocaust, and neither you or I have yet had the opportunity to view the entire piece, or perhaps in your case, any of it. But we know about that it emphasized in that trilogy, those 3 parts, the parallels about what happened in the 40s and 30s and 40s and things that we're experiencing today. And you ticked off a number of them. Charlottesville, January 6th, the way in which, again, people are being pushed into categories And that is a sobering thought. And so it not only doesn't go away, it's important to sort of keep it center of mind. And so I'm going to use that. But first, I again want to reintroduce my guest, Martha-Ann with a debut novel, I keep saying the Three Muses. I want to introduce you and talk further again about these strands of ideas and concepts and that you weave into the Three Muses. And I also want to say, because I didn't say this earlier, it's a debut novel for you, but because you are most obviously a very skilled writer, not only did you get the award from the publisher, but your book has already been very well reviewed by Washington Post and other, there's a website, an online magazine that caters to books and art and culture, that said your novel was one of the most anticipated novels for the second half of 2022. And another magazine said this is one of 57 books that they can't wait to read and that they recommend to others. So this is great praise for you and your abilities. But let's get back into, again, sort of the weaving and add a little bit more to the plot lines here. We have a Holocaust survivor who has memories that he tries to suppress about how he was fortunate enough to survive, but carries guilt with him at some level, comes to America, goes into psychiatry of all things. And then we have a ballerina who's very skilled, had some trauma in her own life, but she's perfected it. And as you used the term, well, you indicated that her success is in part attributable to a choreographer who's helpful, but at the same time, he's an abuser. So take us through a little bit more of the interplay with all of that.
Sure, and I really appreciate your mentioning the reviews. I'm incredibly grateful, and I don't take it lightly. It's very hard to get a novel born, so I feel incredibly grateful. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about the ballerina Katya, and I think in your audience you probably have writers and readers, and I received a lot of early feedback about her that she wasn't likable enough. Likable. First of all, I read a lot of novels. I don't necessarily believe in likability, but I also felt kind of annoyed about it because Katya is very ambitious and she could not be where she is if she didn't have ambition and serious ambition. You cannot become a ballerina just like you cannot become a star basketball player or a star football player, a star tennis player, any of these physical activities, a concert pianist, unless you go all in 300%. And she understands that from a very, very early age, and she wants this. And I felt that some of the feedback I was getting had to do with the fact that she was ambitious. And so, it raises my feminist hackles. What can I say? But she understands her world is very, very narrow. She's an only child.
Let me stop on that for 1 second, because you mentioned I was going to raise it. People make the same comments to an extent about male sports stars, but they seem to tolerate it more.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with I believe it has to do with their maleness. I mean, you can only say so many negative things about LeBron James. You can only say so many negative things about, football players who, seem to be stuck on themselves. But you make an excellent point that we all as people who watch sports or who watch theater or attend ballet, we are happy to have those people extraordinarily skilled, but we are also not happy to be acquainted with their foibles, and we get all torn up about it. But I think it's more specifically geared, a lot of the enmity with females, because we experienced that with the Olympic champions, and we don't have to go into that detail, but please go ahead. I'm sorry to have interrupted.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And so Katya is an only child. When her mother dies, her father is stricken and he has to work. So she grows up in a quiet, lonely household. She has an aunt who takes a great interest in her. This is a what was called a maiden aunt in the 1950s. She's single and she's a secretary in an attorney's office. So she's a career lady. So Katya spends a lot of time by herself, and it's the aunt who actually gets her ballet lessons. And ballet, the world of professional ballet is it's a real bubble. So it's exciting and all those things, and terribly difficult, hard work. But those are the two worlds that Katya knows. She doesn't. I mean, she barely finishes high school like most ballerinas. You don't go to college. You usually get hired when you're 16 or 17 into the professional company. So her world is very narrow, and she understands that Boris Yannikov, the choreographer, is her ticket to the stage, and she also worships him, and that's an uncomfortable truth in this book. And because he does abuse her. And I didn't really want to sugarcoat that. I felt like this is a real thing. We see it all the time in the arts. We see it all over the place, but it's a real thing in the arts. And so she knows he's her ticket to the stage. So she and she is inspired by her work with him. So as she knows, he's given her the stage. He's, as ballerinas say, made ballets on her. They use the preposition on. And when she meets John, although she's never had a true love relationship with a man that's not encumbered, um, she has to think about, is she willing to give this up? What will this do to her relationship with her choreographer? But she's also so torn up about it, and she drops a lot of hints, but she can't figure out how to tell John what's going on, because she does have some understanding that it's not going to make sense to anybody outside of the ballet world.
Okay. Um, let's pick up a little bit, just to one further point. We've mentioned, or you mentioned, the choreographer abusing her, basically, very resonant with the times, using his position of leverage to obviously have sex, but also, I believe we talked about this, is that the choreographer, was working collaboratively
Mhm.
with Katya on the various moves, and she contributed, and yet she was given no byline for her efforts in the collaboration and choreographer, which is again something we hear about a lot today. So that was something that you felt was also important to build into the relationship.
We do hear about that a lot today, and I think as more feminist historians sort of dig around, I mean, the composer Felix Mendelssohn, who's world famous, is said to have probably used many of his sister's compositions and signed them himself. You hear the same thing about Albert Einstein, possibly Mozart. I mean, these are big figures who had women in their lives who may have actually been literally co-creating. And that's Katya's position. And she understands, she is very frustrated. I don't think it wasn't, this is not a, Me Too is not a new thing. I think women throughout history have understood they're not getting credit for their creations. And it's a tremendous frustration. Um, but she can't really fix that. And she doesn't really take Yanikov on about that. Um, so I think, like many women of her era, she was terribly frustrated, but she also didn't, go to the newspapers like you might do today, or go to the press, put it on her Twitter feed, whatever. She basically had to suck it up.
Well, I think it's reflective in what you're saying, is that she cared so much about her craft, and
Mhm.
she cared so much about her success. And this is by no means a justification, But she recognized that if she came out, or if she confronted, in this case, the choreographer, and what's his name again, please?
Boris Yannikov.
Boris, directly, she would risk losing her career, which is not something she was prepared to do. And that, again, is a constant theme, and one that resonant today. It's not, women don't choose to get on a casting couch. Hopefully that term can be hopefully retired at some point, because that's what they want to do, or it's because that is, in many cases, it has proved to be one of the only ways up. And
Right.
there are actors and actresses, which is not the term we use for female actors today, who have been able to buck that and chart their own way without getting permanently blackballed. Interesting
The
use of that
costs are
term.
unbelievable.
But
And I think in the case of the conductor, James Levine, who was the a celebrated Metropolitan Opera conductor, he was abusing young boys, and it didn't really come out until after he died. I mean, there is so much taboo even today. We see it in the Catholic priesthood. Peter Martins, who was ultimately fired from the New York City Ballet, but he was, Balanchine's handpicked successor. And he was, I don't totally understand what he's been accused of, but a lot of it is battering women. And it takes insane amounts of courage to come out about this. Harvey Weinstein, we've seen that. It takes so much courage, and you absolutely risk losing your career. And I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm going to assume that more people lose their careers than get justice by a very large amount.
I don't want to fail to mention, again, moving off tangent, your career in music, because you went from coming to the realization, deciding, or being told you're not ballet material, and you developed passion and skill, and you were in performance mode in music. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and sometimes I can say this more easily saying it backward, that I think that writing, it took me I mean, I was always a writer. My legal jobs always involved a lot of writing. I was the person who snail mailed and wrote in a journal and all that stuff. But in some ways, telling it backwards, I think writing is actually my artistic medium. It took me a medium. It took me a long time to find it. So I did study viola, and I had the tremendous good fortune of falling into the hands of an absolutely extraordinary teacher, mentor, violist, gorgeous musician when I was 14 years old. And he changed my life in very significant ways. And he was he was totally inspiring. And one reason he was so inspiring was that he knew how to deconstruct what he could do and teach you how to practice. His name was Max Aronoff. He was in the first graduating class from Curtis Institute of Music, which
Hmm.
is a preeminent music school in the United States and has always been tuition free. So it has always attracted the best musicians in the world, actually. So he was in the first graduating class, and he also founded the Curtis String Quartet. And I had the good fortune to study with him through high school and part of college. And he he was a great gift of the gab, very salty figure, and he fabulous raconteur. But he had spent his pedagogical life trying to think, how do you train string players um, how to learn how to play viola? And it sounds so obvious, but many musicians cannot teach their craft. They don't understand how to get from point A to point B. So the lessons with Max were about practicing. You had to stay there for an hour and practice. And early on, like really early on, like early in, when I was 14, he was like, no, you need to be practicing 3 hours a day. And in order to be able to practice 3 hours a day, you have to know how to take the music apart and into its component parts. And I've always said, he taught me the value of incremental learning, that if you take things apart, you can do things piece by piece And I think that's true for writing a novel. If you uh, I don't know how to write a novel, but I know how to write a sentence. That's sort of how I think about it. So from there, I played very, very seriously through college, symphony music, chamber music, string quartets, did a lot of performing. Um, I ultimately did not go into music because I felt that although I thought I could have a career, I didn't think I would have any choice. I didn't think I was good enough to have the choices that better musicians have. And I sort of began to feel my own limitations. And I did realize that I had what I guess more comfort, facility with words. And so law school made more sense. Obviously, there were other choices, but what I do want to say is that when I really began writing fiction in earnest, my goal was to get music on the page. I'm still struggling, still trying. I think I have a pretty musical ear and I hear language musically. And so that'll probably be my lifelong pursuit.
But it's again, as I've indicated, it's a you have multifaceted pursuits and you've woven them, if that's the right word, together. Again, my guest today is Martha-Ann Toll, uh, whose novel Three Muses has been very well received, to as an understatement, and tremendous imagination, I would imagine, just to put it together. So that's going to lead me to my question, and I don't mean to be in any way polemic, but why do you think it took you 12 years
That's a
to
good
do
question.
it?
So I have a lot of answers to that. I couldn't, one easy answer is I couldn't get the right order. I got early advice to tell it chronologically, and was not telling it chronologically, so I took it all apart and did that. Then I didn't like the fact that I was telling it chronologically. That was a basic one. It was to figure out a basic structure and in what order to tell the story. I feel like when we get to know a person, we never get a chronological recounting. So I feel like I don't love the chronological recounting.
And they lived happily ever after. You don't like it?
Exactly. So that was one problem. Second problem was that I'm not, despite being extremely organized and rational and analytic in my day job as a lawyer and as a social justice advocate, in fiction land, it's chaos. So a nicer way to say that would be it's organic. Outlines don't do me any good in fiction. So I sort of started in the middle and worked out. And the result of that was I had a lot of things in there that didn't stay. Both of the characters were parents at various times, and they then, in John's case, his children started to take over the novel. And I'm like, this isn't working. So neither of them has children in the finished version. But anyway, there were long tangents that I had to get rid of, and I think this is very typical for beginning novelists. I wrote a lot of backstory and it was too much. So at some point, I had to take out a lot of the backstory because I think it slows readers down. So those are like some of the reasons that it took so long. Also, I had a full time job. Also, I was writing reviews. There's a few other reasons. So
But you have a lot of creative impulses, obviously. And it sounds to me like, even though I'm guessing that your next novels, your next written pieces, um, well, not let me stick with novels. You might say, well, I've learned something about the art, so to speak, of writing, and I can be, um, more facile, I can do it on a more expedited basis. You're not going to presumably change who you are, which is a person who brings a lot into the process and then winnows it down.
yes, and I appreciate that. I guess there's another thing that I want to say because writers don't say this enough, but I happen to be a very fast writer. And it's easy for me, like at work, if you need a memo tomorrow, I can produce that. I am a really, really fast writer. And it is to my detriment. I mean, you hear a lot from writers who have writer's block and they're slow and they can't get a sentence out. It took me, I would say, a good 5 years to slow down enough to really stop at all the icky places where I'm like, I'm rereading this and trying to revise, and I'll just skip that because I don't feel like dealing with it. It took me so long to slow down to a snail's pace where I was looking at every single word, every sentence, and really interrogating whether this is okay, does this follow the meaning of the novel or not? And so I think a lot of my journey has been to slow down, which is a weird thing to say, but it happens to be true.
So I want to ask you another question, again, specifically relating to the book. I'm guessing that people that write nonfiction, it's pretty clear what the purpose is. I
Mhm.
mean, obviously they have multi-purposes, but the purpose of the nonfiction piece is to tell a story about an event or someone living at a particular point in time and getting enough of the full story, what went into that person's thinking, or why was this an epoch moment, or epochal, if that's even a word, moment. Nonfiction, you don't have to, I would guess, have a purpose other than to tell a story. But I'm also guessing that I want you to respond is you had at least one, perhaps many purposes about birthing, if I can use that term, this novel. And I want to find out what that was and what it is you want people to take away from this novel.
I mean, in terms of what I want people to take away, I want this to be some form of entertainment and embracing experience. I don't have another motive. I do deeply believe in telling the Holocaust story forward. I'm really nervous about future generations not understanding it. But I wouldn't say I write fiction with a purpose. I think that I'm not a journalist, and I think that some journalists who go over to fiction to prove a point, I don't think it's great literature. I think it's super important. Like, obviously, Upton Sinclair was incredibly important to write The Jungle. I'm not sure it's great literature. And same for Sinclair Lewis or Theodore Dreiser. Those novels are really important in terms of exposing social problems. I don't think as a fiction writer I have an agenda. And so I can't even answer in some ways what motivates me, but this is why I feel like I have finally found my artistic medium. I am driven. I'm really compelled. I don't even know why. Or, people talk about being called to it. I feel called to writing, and I can't even necessarily say why. It's really weird. It's sort of mystical in a way.
Well, would it be fair to say that it's not a linear purpose, but a purpose is you were highly motivated to
Mhm.
write about these topics and the muses and the connection between memory and wisdom and trauma and love, all that was what you wanted to say, and you wanted to do it in a way in which it wasn't, to use a term, didactic,
Mhm.
because
Exactly.
it's not nonfiction, but the hope was this was so influential to you, you felt you wanted to get it on the page and share it, and um, and that's presumably what you've accomplished. And by all accounts, um, somebody can. It's not a long book. It's 264 pages, if I'm not mistaken, without regard to the preface of any footnotes. So it doesn't. So that it won't take a long time, and somebody could just read it and say, "I'm captivated by the story of John and Katya, and this is what I got out of it, and I can resonate with part of it." But it's a story, and
Exactly.
that's
I feel like we humans like to hear stories. So I think at the basic level, yes, I just want to tell a story. I always aspire to reaching people in their hearts. I really care about that. Like, I hope that readers have an emotional response, but you can't, I always say the writer reader partnership is fully 50-50. So you don't know what the reader will feel, but that's what I hope for.
so we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to revert now to talking about a couple of the other dimensions of you. First of all, again, to repeat, if I didn't say this earlier, you do a lot of book reviews.
Mhm.
And we talked about how when you do a book review, you're not looking at it as an opportunity for you to exercise a negative critical critique. And I think you mentioned to me earlier that if it's a work you don't like, you're probably not going to be the one who wants to write it, because what you're doing is reviewing it so that people who might be interested in the content can get a glimpse as to what it's about. That's one thing you do. So we can talk about
Yeah,
that.
no, I definitely see reviewing early on. I heard some Washington Post critics say this, and I really agree with it, that um, a book reviewer's primary job is to get readers interested in books and to bring new books to readers. So that's what I view my job as. I'm very committed to looking for voices that are maybe have more trouble getting reviewed, less with either independent presses, people of color, women, people who are not going to be in the mainstream immediately. It's really important to me to try to get those voices out because they're terrific and they need to be read. So I see it as what can I bring readers that will give them pleasure and interest.
So in the last few minutes, short time horizon here, what are the one or two really important social justice issues that you think needs to be talked about, or that you're occupying yourself with, that would be instructive to all of us?
Well, so the number one social justice issue that I'm interested in is race in America, and I really believe so deeply that white people need to deeply educate ourselves, about the history in this country. And it's everywhere and it affects everything. And the history is ugly, ugly, ugly. And we need to understand it. We cannot move on as a country without it. In my work life, I worked on homelessness and housing. I was never asked whether I was going to have a choice of housing. Nobody, I mean, the idea that housing is a privilege is just makes me out of my mind. Housing should be a right. We shouldn't be discussing it. We shouldn't have homeless people. We don't need to have homeless people. So that's a big one. And then I spent a lot of time in criminal justice, which gets you to racism immediately. And I just feel like if we could own our history of racism in America and our present racism, we would heal. We would be able to heal as a country. I really so believe this. So I guess that for me, there's really one thing that we need to address. And I'm married to a climate activist, so I need to say global warming, but he's doing that work in our family. But yeah, I mean, I just think our America's history of racism and genocide, we white people have to embrace it and understand.
Well, I'm glad that that is the emphasis, that you're putting that with emphasis, because I think the lines are drawn. There's your viewpoint, which is we need to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, we won't rise above it. But there is, the fight is against the people that say, we don't want to expose that. We don't want to talk about it. That's what happened 240 years ago. It's not happening today. It's not important. And that seems to me to draw the battle line, so to speak, pretty clearly. I
Well,
just,
just like I feel like I tried to communicate in Three Muses, I just feel we ignore history at our peril. Bigotry is really, really dangerous for all of us.
so as they say, Martha Ann Toll, that's the last word on this. We're all privileged to have had you do this interview about your book, Three Muses, and about you and about your sense of justice and history. I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.